A vast fortune was extracted from the Congo through a system so violent, so organized, and so methodical that it almost defies belief when described in full. A small European monarchy, insignificant by the standards of the great imperial powers, turned a huge region of Central Africa into a machine of extraction on an unimaginable scale. And it achieved this not through innovation or progress, but through one of history's oldest methods of wealth creation: control, coercion, and distance. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Belgium extracted a fortune from the Congo, you have to start by clearing up one very important misconception. At first, this was not even Belgium in the ordinary sense. In 1885, after the Berlin Conference helped formalize Europe's scramble for Africa, the Congo Free State was recognized as the personal possession of King Leopold II. Not a normal colony run through a parliament from day one. Not a tidy national project with a flag and a ministry. The king's private domain on a scale so absurd it sounds like satire. Leopold presented the whole enterprise as philanthropic and humanitarian. He spoke the language of anti-slavery, development, and moral uplift. Empires are often at their most dangerous when they arrive sounding helpful. That private ownership structure matters because it explains the incentives. If you run a territory as a personal possession, the question is not how to build a balanced society. The question is how to make it pay. Fast. And for Leopold, the Congo had to pay because the project was expensive, logistically difficult, and politically fragile. Railways had to be built, armed men had to be recruited, resistance had to be broken, European rivals had to be kept at bay. So from the beginning, the Congo was not treated as a community to govern, it was treated as an asset to monetize. That is the through line, not development with exploitation as a side effect, but extraction as the core logic from the start. At first, ivory was a major source of profit. Demand in Europe and North America was strong in the late 19th century, feeding the markets for luxury goods, ornamental carving, piano keys, knife handles, billiard balls, and status object for societies that like to think of themselves as refined while consuming violence from a safe distance. But ivory alone was not what made the Congo regime infamous. The real explosion came with rubber. In the 1890s, world demand surged as pneumatic bicycle tires spread and the automobile industry began to emerge. Suddenly, wild rubber was not just a useful commodity. It was industrial gold, and the Congo had it. That is where the financial story and the human story fuse into one machine. The Congo Free State did not create a normal market economy for rubber. It built a coercive extraction regime. Vast areas were handed over as concessions to private companies or retained as the king's own crown domain. These companies were expected to make profits and pay tribute and taxes to the colonial ruler. That structure made the incentives brutally clear. The less they spent on wages, infrastructure, and consent, the more they could extract. So instead of building a legitimate labor market, the regime relied on force. Villages were ordered to meet rubber men, were driven into forests to gather wild rubber. Families were taken hostage. Beatings and lashings enforced impossible demands. When a modern world wanted rubber, the Congo supplied it through terror disguised as administration. This was not chaotic violence floating around a weak frontier. It was organized violence tied to revenue. The force public, the armed force of the regime, existed to impose order in the imperial sense of the word, not peace, but compliance. The system worked because local populations could be forced to deliver labor without the state paying anything like the true cost of that labor. That is one of the darkest recurring patterns in economic history. Extraordinary profit often depends on some group being kept outside the normal protections of contract, law, or bargaining power. The spreadsheet looks brilliant only because the human cost has been pushed off the books and the profit really was extraordinary. Leopold extracted a fortune from the Congo, first through ivory and then through rubber as prices soared. The key point is not just that money was made, but how directly it flowed upward. This was not an economy where the gains were broadly reinvested in the territory for the benefit of the people producing them. It was a transfer system. Wealth moved out, power stayed external, risk stayed local. Congolese communities endured the punishments, dislocation, hunger, and coercion. The regime and its associated interests captured the upside. That model would become very familiar in later colonial economies. But here it appeared in one of its purest and ugliest forms. The perversity of the arrangement was easiest to see in what did not happen. If this had been a genuine developmental project, the boom in rubber prices would have led to investment in health, transport that served local communities, wages, bargaining structures, and agricultural stability. Instead, forced labor and punitive quotas intensified. The system rewarded terror because terror was efficient. It lowered labor costs, maximized output, and shortened the distance between global demand and royal profit. For investors and rulers far away, the Congo looked productive. For the people inside it, productivity meant something else entirely. Utilization, hostage-taking, exhaustion, village disruption, and a social fabric torn apart so that Europe could inflate tires and congratulate itself on progress. Modernity has often been less glamorous up close. What makes this story especially important for the financial historian is that it was not just a moral atrocity, it was also a very modern business model. There was branding, there was political cover, there were concession structures, there were tax and tribute arrangements, there was an armed enforcement mechanism, there was a commodity boom, there were private gains wrapped in public language, and there was a governing fiction that the system existed to improve the territory rather than drain it. Strip away the uniforms and the missionary language, and you can already see the outlines of 20th century resource extraction everywhere. Control the asset, suppress labor costs, externalize suffering, defend the arrangement as necessary for order, and let distance do the moral work. But even systems built on fear eventually develop an accounting problem of their own. In the Congo, the profits were visible, but so were the contradictions. Edmund Dean Morel, working in shipping, noticed something telling in the trade patterns. The Congo was exporting large quantities of valuable goods like rubber and ivory, but what came back and did not look like the normal exchange of a functioning commercial economy. Instead of a healthy flow of trade goods being bought by willing producers, there was a heavy movement of firearms and ammunition. Morel drew the obvious conclusion. If valuable commodities were coming out and normal payment was not going in, then force was filling the gap. It was one of the clearest financial tells in imperial history. The books were speaking, and what they were saying was ugly. That mattered because it punctured the myth. Once activists, missionaries, and investigators began exposing what was happening, the Congo became an international scandal. Roger Casement's report and the broader Congo reform movement helped turn what had been treated as a remote colonial enterprise into a public, moral, and political crisis. The issue was not merely that abuses had occurred. It was that the abuses were not accidental. They were integral to the profit system. Without forced labor, the railroad could not be built on the same terms. The concessions would not have been as lucrative, resistance would have been harder to crush, and the whole fantasy of easy tropical wealth would have looked much less impressive. When a regime is structured around extraction without fair exchange, coercion is not a breakdown of the model. It is the model. By 1908, the pressure had grown too intense to ignore. Leopold's personal rule over the Congo Free State ended, and the territory was annexed by Belgium as the Belgian Congo. That transition is often described as a reform moment, and in one sense, it was. The sheer extremity of Leopold's private regime had become diplomatically toxic, but viewers should not make the mistake of assuming the underlying economic logic disappeared. It changed form, it became more bureaucratic, more systematic, and in some respects more polished. Forced labor was partially suppressed, but coercion did not vanish. Under Belgian colonial rule, the Congo continued to function as an extraction economy shaped around European interests. The vocabulary softened, the structure remained familiar. And this is where the story broadens from rubber terror into the longer architecture of Belgian wealth. Under formal colonial rule, extraction became more diversified and more industrial. Katanga, in particular, became central. The region's mineral wealth, especially copper and later cobalt and uranium, helped turn the Congo into one of the most economically important colonies in Africa. The Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, formed in 1906, became a giant of the copper industry, and by the early 1930s, it was the largest copper-producing company in the world. By the time Congo approached independence, foreign firms still controlled the commanding heights of the formal economy, and companies like Union Minière remained vast sources of revenue and foreign exchange. In other words, the rubber regime was not the end of the fortune. It was the opening act. This is one of the reasons the Congo matters so much in economic history. It shows how an empire or quasi-empire can move from one extraction model to another without changing the basic hierarchy. First came ivory and rubber under a private sovereign regime. Then came more formal colonial administration tied to mining, infrastructure, and industrial-scale resource removal. Different commodities, different institutions, same basic direction of wealth out. Congo was rich in assets and poor in control. That is not a contradiction in colonial history. It is often the point. Real wealth sits in the ground or in the labor of the population. Political power determines who captures it, and the fortunes extracted were not abstract. They helped sustain Belgium's standing as a colonial power and fed into the wider financial networks of Belgian capitalism. Leopold himself became associated with lavish building and public works back home, while the Congo paid the invisible bill. This is how imperial wealth often works politically. The metropole sees monuments, prestige, industry, and national confidence. The colony sees quotas, armed enforcement, and a life reorganized around someone else's balance sheet. The wealth looks civilized by the time it reaches Europe. It becomes boulevards, institutions, copper supply chains, investment groups, and respectable fortunes. Extraction always looks cleaner after transport. So, what is the present-day connection? It is not that the world is identical, because it is not. It is that the underlying mechanics are still everywhere. Resource-rich countries are still often trapped in systems where the asset is valuable, the population is vulnerable, and external capital plus political power determine who captures the gains. Commodity booms still invite stories about development that turn out to be mainly stories about control. Multinationals still operate in places where labor, law, and sovereignty are uneven. Financial markets still reward extraction long before they ask who paid the human price. Consumers in wealthy countries still enjoy the finished products of distant coercion while speaking as if supply chains were acts of nature. The names change. Rubber clears throat, then cobalt now. Copper then, rare earths now. But the grammar of exploitation stays alarmingly stable. There's also a sharper personal lesson buried inside this. When people think about financial education, they usually imagine budgeting, investing, maybe inflation, maybe taxes. All useful. But real financial education also means learning how wealth is made at scale. It means understanding that fortunes are often built not by creating fair value inside clean markets, but by controlling choke points: land, labor, law, force, transport, and information. The Congo is an extreme case, but clarifies the rule. The biggest money is often made when one side has no meaningful ability to refuse the terms. That was true in imperial extraction, and softer versions of it still haunt the modern financial system. The final lesson is as simple as it is disturbing. Belgium did not extract a fortune from the Congo because it was unusually industrious or uniquely brilliant. It extracted a fortune because it built a system in which coercion lowered costs, political distance hid the suffering, and global demand converted violence into profit. First rubber, then minerals, always under structures designed to keep control elsewhere, obligation local. That is what viewers should remember. Not just that the Congo was rich, and not just that Leopold was brutal, but that money and power work best for themselves when they can turn human beings into inputs and call the result progress. History does not repeat itself in exact form, but its patterns remain dangerously familiar if left unrecognized. If this gave you new perspective, consider subscribing. Because understanding history is not about the past. It is about seeing the system before it repeats in new disguise.